Hey, welcome to another episode of the Overcoming Adversity podcast. I'm your host, Michael Allison. Today, we are honored to have Cheyenne Hunt, a trailblazer in the political world. Cheyenne has made history as she is the first Gen Z woman to run for Congress, and her journey of resilience and determination is one that will inspire us all. I can't wait for us to get into this conversation and hear her story. Hey, Cheyenne, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
Man, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, especially at this particular time in our world with so many things that's going on. If you can, tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what even brought you even into the thought or the mindset or the concept of saying, hey, I want to step into the political space.
Yeah, I think I don't get a lot of opportunities to really delve into the details of my upbringing in a meaningful way. And given the content of your podcast and the theme of overcoming adversity, it's cool to have an opportunity to spend a little bit more time on that. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of people can relate to it. I grew up, I was raised by a single mother. I experienced domestic violence growing up as a child. And it was really my single mother and my single grandmother, these two generations of single women, descendants of Syrian refugees, that raised me. And I was incredibly lucky to see two generations of women that were redefining what it meant to be leaders in their field, right? Like we're
Right.
talking about someone born in the 40s, someone born in the 60s, and really trailblazing and going places where women hadn't gone, both in the boardroom and also in the fields of philanthropy. And so that was really incredible. But, in my upbringing, it was not necessarily easy. I grew up in a really rural, really low income part of California, and we struggled before we really started to thrive. And, I also experienced having a parent incarcerated as a child. And that's something that all too many Americans have, had to contend with in this era of mass incarceration, particularly minority families and families of color. And so, it really all kind of shaped me and my perspective on the world because I saw quite a few things that weren't quite right about the status quo. It took three generations for my family to be able to send somebody to college. I was the first in my family to go to college and on to law school. And that's not quite the American dream that we're selling, right? We talk about
Right.
how if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you achieve that white picket fence dream, then everything's possible. But for my immigrant family, it took three generations for that to become the truth, really four, because my great grandfather was the one that came over from Syria through Ellis Island. And that just didn't seem quite right to me. And I also just saw the barriers to entry for women in so many of these fields. And so all of that pushed me to politics because I always felt like the biggest way to have an impact in my journey in this life was to find where I could be of highest service and do the most good. And this has always kind of been an interest of mine. And I saw, as things have gone on here since maybe 2016, this massive regression. And
Mhm.
it felt more important than ever for young people, and particularly young women, to be in the arena.
Well, I love that answer. As you're sharing that with me, it resonated so deeply for myself. Coming from Jamaica, and my family are immigrants coming to Jamaica on boats from Cuba, and
Yep.
so many different aspects of that, and then all of the American dreams that we're taught as young kids. So I'm so proud of you for even taking that big bold step, knowing all of the different feats and things that could be stacked against you, and you choose to defy the odds. I want to follow up because I think you set such a great example and you're overcoming so many different challenges. Can you talk a little bit about what was that actual motivational piece or aspect in regards to say, now I want to take this and I actually want to start running for Congress?
Yeah. I got really lucky with my grandmother and my mother and
Mhm.
the universe that I was raised in because they both had careers that were focused on people and specifically, leadership training, motivation, and were really groundbreakers in the way of mindset training.
Mhm.
And so I had always been taught, as long as I can, remember, that our highest duty on this earth is to leave it better than we found it and to make a difference in the lives of others. And that's the legacy that you'll leave behind. And it was just a question of what was that vehicle going to be for me? And was it going to be, trying to find my place in a family business or, really venturing out on my own. And I think I saw when I went to college, I was in college in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected.
Mm-hmm.
And the immediate shockwave it sent through the system and the fear that many experienced as a result. Many of my friends of, Muslim heritage and folks who, were basically immediately ostracized and felt that very palpable sense of danger because it had become emboldened.
Right.
And it was clear that rampant racism and sexism wasn't a deal breaker for quite a large swath of the country. That I think spurred me to take this leap and jump in that direction. And so I started working in politics when I was in college. I started community organizing, trying to write ballot measures to get dark money out of politics and to clean the system up. And I went and worked for Senator Amy Klobuchar. And I was working for her in the Senate Judiciary Committee when Donald Trump was impeached and witnessing that impeachment trial and the historic nature of it. I feel like there's so many things that have happened in this country over the past 6 or 7 years that get labeled as unprecedented, that we're almost like immune to the shock value of it now. But the truth is, so many of our norms that have been our democratic norms that were built into the system to protect its vulnerabilities, the inherent fragility of democracy have been violated. And so I really saw that. And as a young person, watching women's rights regress, feeling as though our future had really been sold to the highest bidder, as 40% of my generation never believed we'll be able to own a home. And feeling this really palpable fear about the environment, which is super prescient for me right now. I'm in Orange County and I'm literally in the middle of a triangle of devastating fires. All of that really pushed me to get involved. And my home district, there's a representative that is deeply disconnected from the people, and I saw an opportunity to jump in, and we just went for it when everyone else said we needed to wait our turn. And it was an incredible experience, to say the least.
I was going to ask if you could expound a little bit on that, because I think it's such a pivotal and important time in our life when this happened. While you was working with the senator, what were some key takeaways? What was it like in regards to like some experiences that you've had that people from the outside may not have known about or seen about, that you could share from firsthand experience?
Yeah. One of the things that we don't talk about a lot about the Senate, and this is probably like not that hot of a take, but I just found it really interesting about Capitol Hill in general. Capitol Hill would not function without the labor of unpaid interns.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of people in that building are either unpaid or very, very lowly paid staff members, and they're young and they're ambitious. Senior staffers are in their early 20s. It's really incredible, the energy in that place, which is strange because then you juxtapose that with the average age of a United States senator being like 65. So it's kind of odd because a lot of the ambition and the bills that are being written and the energy that's going on, I was lucky in that Senator Klobuchar is very active and incredibly engaged. But, I had plenty of friends on Capitol Hill who worked for representatives that were just kind of there and were aging out. And yet, the lifeblood is young people really coming up with these legislative proposals and moving the needle. And it was kind of crazy I was her youngest ever law clerk in the Senate Judiciary and the youngest ever law clerk in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And to have my hand directly in this impeachment trial, this impeachment of a former president for what would amount to basically treason, because it was the first impeachment related to his attempt to incite Ukraine into investigating Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that a lot of people who weren't there probably missed the gravity of was the moment that Mitt Romney voted to impeach Donald Trump.
Mm.
The shockwave it sent through the building was palpable because we all truly had this belief that it was destined to be a party line vote and that our democracy had so degraded that there was no universe in which someone would be capable of putting country over party and taking seriously their vow that they take at the very beginning of an impeachment hearing to uphold the values of the United States Constitution. And when we saw Mitt Romney get up there at that podium and very vulnerably, tearfully talk about the fact that he had to pledge to God when he took that pledge, that he would uphold those values. And finally, something meant more than partisan loyalty. To see that show of values and that breaking from, this really, really bleak, super divided partisan landscape. Obviously, it didn't change the outcome because the rest of the vote was party line. The impeachment it didn't go all the way through the Senate. However, we're in the business of looking for hope here, because if you don't have it and you fall into nihilism, there's no universe where you're going to be able to continue to be in this fight in a meaningful way. And any little nugget that we could grab onto was invaluable, and that was a huge, huge moment. I mean, people were crying, just in disbelief. So, I think about that a lot, and I still get chills.
Wow. Let me ask you this. What do you believe is some of the most pressing issues and topics, especially for Gen Zs, and how do you plan to address that as you go on your path to your political career as well too?
Yeah, I am bringing into I'm about to launch kind of a handful of new projects that are really keenly focused on these issues, because the fight continues, whether you win a race or you lose it. It's not about me. It's not about the single candidates. We're in this fight right now for our rights, and it's an existential one. And so I think for Gen Z, we're really looking at a future that's been sold to the highest bidder. And we're more politically engaged than any young generation in modern history because we can't afford not to be. I think top of mind for many of us, obviously the environment, because we're already living out climate catastrophe, and in our lifetimes, it's projected to be exponentially worse. Other than climate, we're looking at an economy that's really been rigged for a handful of folks at the top. And we're also essentially getting gaslit by older generations who remember when it was different and don't necessarily understand what this universe looks like right now for us economically, to be forced to take on, and I say forced intentionally, by the way. I got a lot of people in my comments who get upset about that. But to really be forced to take on a huge sum of debt before many of us were even legal adults, and to be, handcuffed to that for the rest of our lives and careers in order to get an entry-level, good paying job, a meaningful career, that's a huge setback. And we're getting lectured by folks who went to UC Berkeley for $1,000 a semester, and it's just not the same reality. We're in a universe where the average American family is one unexpected medical bill away from bankruptcy, and we're not feeling a lot of hope. And then the other thing that I'll say, which a lot of folks were really surprised by, is the way that Gen Z has reacted to international affairs and has rejected the status quo of what has come to be. We reacted with horror to the assault on Gaza, and obviously understand that Israel has a right to defend itself, but how they do so matters. And that status quo has been shaken up by how active Gen Z has been, with advocating for the human rights of Palestinians. And so I think all of those things are really leading us to be incredibly active. And obviously for young women right now, we're seeing a huge divide, the biggest gender divide of any generation in American history, between young women trending more progressive and young men going to the radical right. A lot of that has to do with social media, and I could talk about that for probably 10 years because I was a tech policy expert on Capitol Hill and with the Biden administration. But it's really, we're dealing with an epidemic of loneliness. There's a lot that younger generations are deeply concerned about, and so I think that's why we're seeing them get so engaged.
I think you take a big bold stance, and I like that. In regards to taking a bold stand, can you share a little bit about where did that come from you personally? Was it from your childhood? Because taking a bold stand, some people always worry about like the repercussions of it, right? But I don't see you as that type of person or anything from that, right? So can you talk a little bit about where that resilience came from for yourself in regards to like taking a bold stand? And then do you even think about or worry about anything or any backlashes or naysayers or anything like that for yourself?
Yeah, I think resilience for me was developed out of a certain degree of necessity growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I lived with a lot of fear. I lived with a lot of, again, from kind of just experiencing domestic violence, and having a parent incarcerated. My grandmother made it abundantly clear to me that the choice was, really to live a small life or to buck up, soldier, as she would say, and to take it head on, specifically to choose out of victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that built in me a certain kind of resilience. I wasn't born that way. It's definitely an acquired skill. I was a really soft, gentle, shy child. And I think that at my core, that's very much actually who I still am. But we don't talk enough about the fact that so much of being bold is not being fearless.
Mm.
I am a high strung, fairly anxious person. And I worry a lot. I have a PhD in worrying and the worst case scenario. But I also know that you can be afraid and do it anyway. And that was one of the things that I really had to come up against running for office, was looking fear in the face and knowing that it was there and taking the step anyway. And I swear it's a skill, and you start to do it over and over and over again. And then it just completely changes your risk tolerance and the things that scared me and the things that I thought were problems 2 years ago are like a cakewalk now. After running for office, being called a terrorist by a sitting congresswoman, it's it's just like a whole different universe of fear now. And that's not to say that I don't care about backlash. I care deeply. But I also know that I got really clear on my values and where I'll compromise and where I won't. And we can compromise on solutions and the steps we take to make progress, but we can't compromise our values. And that's one thing I don't do.
I love that. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about the social media aspects of things here. So, how has your digital presence and social media following has helped you with engaging with your younger voters and the advancement when it comes to like the political platform too as well?
Yeah, social media is one of those things that was a double-edged sword for me, and I didn't expect it, because we had seen so many candidates. I won't say so many, but quite a few candidates before me, and folks in policy or professionals, specifically men, who were able to build social media platforms and go on to run for office, or start their law practice or their consulting firm, or whatever they were doing, and have that be a really big boost for their legitimacy and their credibility. And for me, I had a very different experience in that I got labeled an influencer immediately, and people took that to mean that I was fundamentally unserious and
Mhm.
unqualified. And I think that there's a misogynistic stereotype of what a woman on social media is
Mm.
versus a man. And, I had articles written about me in that regard. I lost endorsements. I really, really struggled to gain legitimacy in my race. And when I would have conversations with people and actually, have conversations about my resume, that I worked in the Senate, that I had advised the Biden White House, that I'm an attorney, that I had defended domestic violence survivors in court, that I had drafted legislation, um, people had no idea because that wasn't the story that was getting run,
Right. Wow.
and
Wow.
that wasn't what was getting told. So I was shocked. I really expected that this following and these millions of views that I was getting would just do what they had done for others and really give me this launching pad. And it ended up being this double edged sword because I was able to find support and community and solidarity online. And then I was getting punished for it. And yeah, I mean, I just think that that's something worth talking about, especially because, I would be labeled an influencer and there was a male candidate running at the same time who had more followers than I did and was more chronically online, and he never once got that label.
Mm.
So it was just really interesting, and I think that it can be a great vehicle to reach out to young voters. It's certainly effective for communicating messaging and advocacy, but at the end of the day, elections are won on the ground, and so are issues. And being able to use it as a vehicle, either through like fundraising or recruiting volunteers, to actually do that work of building that movement on the ground is critical. And we've seen too that it's not enough on its own, but it can really be a tool.
Wow. That's interesting. I've heard quite a few different stories, but to hear from you firsthand, to hear about some of the things that took place, very, very, very interesting points. I want to ask you something about this day and age, as AI is now the new wave of things, right? And it's one of the biggest things that's out here. So, what are your thoughts around the future of integrating AI, and how do you think it will impact America and the workforce too, as well?
Yeah, so AI is really interesting. I worked on a couple of bills and some draft legislation in a former role on Capitol Hill in the very beginning of, you know, chat GPT, when we knew that AI was going to fundamentally change things, and it was here
Mhm.
now. And I think that all of our worst kind of predictions of where this was going to go have seemed to come to fruition. And I'm not a Luddite. I believe that America has a responsibility to be on the front line of innovation, and specifically innovation to make our lives better and to remain competitive internationally. We should be winning the AI war,
Mhm.
and this race. There's no reason why we shouldn't beat China here. And what I'm fundamentally concerned about is that in the tech universe, we have a deeply monopolized system.
Right.
We have essentially five giants: Apple, Google, Meta, and they control Microsoft. They control the entire landscape, and they're now controlling mostly the development and implementation of AI.
Right.
And those technologies serve to only fortify their monopolies and completely shut out the potential of small businesses. And that's really scary because this is a very powerful thing. And to have a bunch of unaccountable billionaires in control of it is something that should give us all pause. And there's definitely potential, obviously, for AI to really make our lives better. They've seen really promising studies in cancer screenings, for example. But and obviously, there's great creative and work potential. But at the same time, there's also potential to just effectively automate systems of inequality that exist right now, and then claim that, without accountability, that whatever outcomes it produces are just and neutral because there's no human error, when we know that that's not how that works. And the other thing I'm really concerned about is election interference. And we're already seeing it play out all across the internet right now. False images being generated. Taylor Swift references it in her post endorsing Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, that part of the reason she felt the need to speak out is that Donald Trump is sharing AI generated images of her claiming that he's got her endorsement. And for that to not be regulated is absolutely crazy. For a presidential candidate to be able to put out falsely generated endorsements, I mean, that's really a danger to truth and election integrity. And so I think that there's some really common sense regulation that we can incorporate to ensure both the veracity and the truth of what's going on, and also to make sure that these innovations don't just serve to further line the pockets of a handful of people in the boardroom, but that they're also really trickling down that innovation to the quality of life of workers. And that, you know, if we're going to innovate, I would rather see AI result in a 4-day work week than in 40,000 job cuts.
Mhm.
So I think that there's just universes where we can really use this to make life better, and our regulators have a responsibility to be on the front line of that.
I agree with you on that. I want to, if you expound on that a little bit. I recently was at a university, and we were having a conversation around the safety in regards to like the around the university, with even before we even bringing AI into the university. Can you talk a little bit about what would you propose in regards to privacy and data security when it comes to AI just being integrated into the workforce as well too?
Yeah, I support Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposal, and we were really excited in my former role. I watched parts of that come to life, and one of the things that we in the tech space mostly have been calling for is to mirror some of what Europe has done and adopt and form a digital regulator, an agency, like within the executive branch, much like the Federal Trade Commission or the Environmental Protection Agency. We need a digital agency, a digital regulator that exists with rulemaking authority to protect our data, to regulate AI, and to hold companies accountable for their algorithms and the impact that those have on society. What we found is the American legislative process is intentionally very slow. For bills to get across the finish line through the House and the Senate takes years, if it ever happens. And as you know, things have become more divided, it's gotten even slower. And given that reality, any bill that's written right now to regulate technology is going to be obsolete by the time it eventually gets across the finish line. And so to have an independent digital regulator that's able to be inherently more responsive and that has enforcement authority puts us in a position to be able to actually respond to these new technologies as they're being developed, instead of basically leaving the American public to be lab rats for the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world.
I recently had an opportunity to have a talk about the workforce and what are some of the discrepancies that's tied into that. And we was looking at it, and when it comes to your millennials accord versus your baby boomers. Can you talk a little bit about how do you think Gen Zs are shaping the workforce in the coming future, if not right now? And then what are some of the things that you see there are some potential challenges in the future as well too?
Gen Z has made exciting shifts, I would say, upon our entry to the workforce. Gen
Mhm.
Z has really shaken up the workforce by jumping in and shifting expectations of what's normal and really coming in with strong work-life boundaries. I know that it's not necessarily popular among employers, but I think that we're part of the reason why we're starting to see states by states introducing legislation to give workers the right to disconnect, where you're not on call to your boss 24/7. I think that part of it is we've led these trends, whether it's quiet quitting or the Great Resignation, where we're just not buying what the promise that was being sold, which is this idea that you get a job and you stay there for 45 years and you steadily get promoted and your quality of life gets better and you'll achieve the American dream. And we're not buying it because that's not what's actually on offer. We've seen clearly our parents, the millennials that came before us, try to work that system. And the truth is, you are replaceable at your job. You are not replaceable in your life.
Mm.
As a partner, as a son or daughter, as a friend, as a parent. And given the really limited opportunities. We're struggling with cost of living deeply. Wages have been stagnant for over 70 years while corporate profits are at all-time highs. Why would we give every ounce of ourselves to a job that's not going to give us an inch back? And that's obviously not every workplace. Clearly it's not, but it is incredibly common. And so I think that we've just seen an adjustment in expectations. And that's also led to workers really effectively advocating for changes in the workplace that make them more compelling and make them more interesting for us to consider staying at in the long term. So it's pretty exciting. And I also just think that there's still a huge tension between older generations and younger generations in the workplace, and two different universes of what they think should be expected. So it's still sorting itself out, and I'm excited to see how it does all shake out.
Absolutely. I want to touch on this coming election and some things that surround it, because as I've been growing up and seeing different elections and things that's tied around it, sometimes you kind of, there are some things that are flawed. Can you talk a little bit about what are some changes, if any, that you think in regards to like the terms, or what are the qualifications and things like that for anyone to run for certain seats, certain positions when it comes to that? Because I think that also ties to, should a person vote or not vote? Do they want to go out and vote because of who's actually running and all of those different things that's tied to it?
That's a great question. I personally think, for one, if we are going to prevent felons from voting, we should prevent convicted felons from running. If you're not fit to cast a ballot, how the hell are you fit to run the country? That seems wildly hypocritical. But separately, I think that obviously in the last couple of years, we've seen real concern over the aging, population of lawmakers, and there's questions about capacity and mental acuity. I think that the biggest, and obviously we can talk about term limits, and there are pros and cons, but I generally support term limits. I think that it's a really responsible thing to adopt, given how deeply entrenched this system is right now. I definitely support term limits for Supreme Court justices as well, because I think that the massive insulation that we have there, and the way that essentially a handful of totally unaccountable people control the destiny and the freedoms of the American public for generations, is problematic. And having a little bit more responsible turnover there makes sense. But the biggest thing that I think we have to do if we want to look at having more integrous elections is not voter ID laws, because when you look at the data, it's abundantly clear that voter fraud happens in numbers that are statistically insignificant. But instead, it's getting unaccountable, unlimited corporate dollars out of politics. As someone who's now run in this system, I can tell you that the vast majority of this ball game comes down to who has the most money. Mm-hmm. Because what wins elections is ads on Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy. That's who's voting. And you only get there with money. And to have money pouring into our elections from corporations and wealthy individuals who don't have to even admit that they're the ones funding these candidates, we're essentially letting an unaccountable class of millionaires and billionaires decide who's going to represent all of us in Congress. And that's a problem. And it also keeps these folks who have been there for generations entrenched, because they have the longstanding relationships with the big oil lobbyists and the big tech lobbyists. And it's there, that money funnel is on. And by the way, that also controls the way that they vote. People don't want to talk about that either. But when you are dependent on the funding of a handful of corporations and wealthy donors, you're going to vote in their interest. When they pick up the phone, or when they call, you're going to pick up the phone, not your constituent at home that can only afford to chip in $5 or $10 a month. And that's fundamentally undemocratic. That's an oligarchy. We don't like to talk about how much that resembles the Russian oligarchy. But that really is the dark underbelly of American democracy right now, is that it's truly all about money, and regulating campaign finance law is the only way to return the power to the voters.
Absolutely. So quite a few topics are very important to me when it comes to politics and who I vote for and things around that. Do you have any insights, or is there anything you could share about another two topics that is very important to me as well? One is around veterans, as I'm someone that served in our military, and another one that I'm a big advocate for is around mental health. And the other one that I'm a big advocate for is around the homelessness that's tied to the veteran aspects too as well. So I don't know if you had any thoughts or any opinions or any insights around those things that you could share when it comes to politics, and anything that could actually be done about it, or some things that are in place, or some things that you advocate for too as well too.
Yeah, and all three of those things are obviously deeply interconnected, right? When you experience that overlap between veterans coming home, experiencing massive trauma, or emotional trauma, traumatic brain injuries, struggling with receiving proper health care, mental or physical, ending up homeless. That's a really unfortunately common American story, and it's a disgrace. It's something that I think should be a deep national embarrassment. And yet we have candidates at the top of the ticket who are pretty well known for, when it comes to Trump and JD Vance, really degrading service. And JD Vance just said this morning that he's open to trying to privatize the VA, which would mean making this a service for profit, and would inherently lessen and cheapen the quality of care, which is already awful.
Right.
I think that veterans issues are going through a really interesting shift. For so long, they have been deeply rooted in the Republican Party, because that's where funding for the military came from, and thus, generally funding for salaries, for mental health care, for physical care. And now there's just been a priority shift. And I don't know that the average American voter has caught that yet. But what I will say is, as much as, I have my qualms with both parties about military policy, I think that the Democratic Party has done a much better job at really respecting the sacrifice of veterans and wanting to pay that forward accordingly. But still, we need a massive investment in the VA, because a lot of where all of these problems stem from is the lack of proper care upon returning home.
Mm-hmm.
When every veteran is not screened for and treated for PTSD, for untreated injuries, for exposure, we set them up to fail upon reentry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's cruel. It's just cruel, and it's immoral. And so the VA should be the best quality healthcare in the world. And for folks to have to be waiting in dingy lobbies and to be on waiting lists that last months to receive essential life-saving care is just embarrassing. And so I really think that, it's a moral issue, and they deserve the investment, because they've invested in our country and our freedom.
Absolutely. Cheyenne, as we get ready to wrap up here, I have two more questions for you. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of coalition building, and how is it helping like your political career? Because I think that's something that's important in this day and age, in this time that we're dealing with so many things.
I'll tell you a story about coalition building, because I think that that's the best way to really paint the picture of why we need it so badly right now when it comes to getting great legislation actually passed and to be more effective advocates. So much of what has happened right now in the American political system is either you fall into one of the parties and that's your whole line of advocacy, or you have single issue advocacy groups. And that could be the teachers union, that could be the environmental groups, that could be the consumer regulatory groups. and they're very niche. They
Mhm.
have their thing that they care about. But the truth is that our world, our globalized economy, so many, and in the technological revolution, so many of these things have become deeply interconnected, and we share common values. And when we can stand in solidarity, it it's really incredibly effective. So for my example here, I worked on tech policy for a long time, specifically trying to regulate Facebook when they were undergoing a handful of, really problematic uh, growth. They were looking at expanding into a number of different fields that a lot of folks were concerned about. They were looking at trying to become and form a universal digital currency that they would control. They were looking at launching products specifically for kids and teenagers. And then the whistleblower came forward, Frances Haugen came forward and revealed that Facebook, she had tons of documents from inside the company, revealed that they had been promoting misinformation, that they failed to content moderate the organization of the January 6th riot on their platform, that they were complicit in a genocide in Myanmar, that they knowingly promoted content to teenage girls that encouraged eating disorders and suicide. And we were trying to look at, okay, how do we most effectively advocate for regulation of Facebook? And the truth was that it was such an interconnected issue, and the tent could have been so big that the most effective way we could have done it was to build a coalition.
Mhm.
And we ended up getting people involved in a rally that I planned, and on these group calls that had never spoken to each other before, but were absolutely dynamite advocates. We had the AFT, which is one of the main teachers unions in the country, talking to Earth Justice, talking to digital financial regulators, talking to students organizations, talking to, mental health people, this entire universe of folks that all had a stake in this issue. And as a result, this became headline news because
Mhm.
we were all in this game together. And that's really, I think, something that's so missing in society right now is the community aspect, the coalition. And when we can come together across all of our different interests, our different backgrounds, embrace our diversity, and move forward with a common goal, it's an incredibly effective strategy that, in my next project, I'm really focused on coalition building as, a number one priority, because I think that that's the future.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. From your story, from all of your experiences, what advice would you give young women, future leaders that's aspiring to even make a difference, just like yourself, making a difference now today in politics or even public service?
Especially young women, I would say go for it, because we absolutely have to, and know that you're going to get punched in the face anyway. Uh, just know that. And if you're expecting it, the punch that hurts the most is the one you're not expecting.
Mm.
So know that this is part of it, but we genuinely can't afford not to. And you have such a support system of folks that are in this fight already that will welcome you with open arms. You just have to look around, and it can feel really isolating and really vulnerable, but that's kind of the power of it, honestly, is that human element, that being vulnerable and being willing to put skin in the game and go for it. And I definitely think that we live in a society that doesn't want to acknowledge that misogyny is still alive and well, but it is. And we're seeing it out of the mouth of someone who's a former president of the United States, and all down that line. But we are going to be the ones who are the captains of our fate. And so it's up to us. The ball is in our court to really dive in and do this. And so, that also doesn't mean that we can't have fun and we can't take care of ourselves. One of the things that I always say is that joy is also a fundamental act of resistance right now in this world,
Mhm.
especially if you are a woman or a person of color, because there are so many people rooting against us and our freedoms. And when we can find joy in the face of oppression and find rest, that's also an act of resistance. And it's something that we have to do in order to continue to be effective advocates in this movement. It's your right. It is your fundamental right. And we owe it to the ones who come behind us, the next generation, to model that you have to take care of yourself, that you deserve it. And so think about, the example that you're setting on this journey too. So that's always like a message I try to impart whenever we're talking about advocates and what my advice is, because burnout is rampant among us, and it's really, really hard to stay hopeful and to stay fresh when it feels bleak. So access joy, because it's your fundamental right and you deserve it.
Absolutely. Before we get out of here, do you have any final words? And also, where can folks find you in regards to social media or your website if they want to get you on their podcast or have you on stage to speak about some of the topics that are important to you as well?
Yeah. So my team, you can reach us at Cheyenne, spelled like the capital of Wyoming, Cheyenne, at CheyenneHunt.com. And you can find me on social media. TikTok is Cheyenne Hunt CA, like the state of California. And my Instagram is Cheyenne.L.Hunt.
Well, Cheyenne, it's been a pleasure to have you on the Overcoming Adversity podcast to come and share your story of some of the things that you've been through, but how you're just making a bold force and taking bold steps in your life and throughout your career. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thanks, Michael.
You are welcome. Until next time, guys, God bless.
Ain't it all? Couple dollars in my pocket, no income and go. Been working on my body, getting healthier. Thank God for